Greetings, beautiful people. We're going to continue our conversation about learning, in particular operant conditioning, and we're going to start off with a quick story and then move into a quiz, and then we'll get into the meat of it. I want you to remember the phrase, it's all about the outcomes. It's all about the outcomes. Okay, so I promised you a story, and this is from maybe the late 1990s. I was an undergraduate student, and I completed a psychology class from a child psychologist who happened to be a behaviorist. So I thought, what better way to talk about this topic with reliving an experience that I had. So anyway, this particular teacher, he had a policy that he wanted his students to leave the first row that was closest to the door open, so that if students were to come in late, they could sit in that first row. And this was, the rationale was that no one would interrupt lecture by walking in front of him while he, was sharing his wisdom with the class. So in this particular class, I sat about 3 rows over from the door. So in the front, but not quite front and center. And I just doodled and drew pictures, but I paid attention. Now, I should mention that the door in this class had a little glass window on the door so that when it was closed, you could still see out. Anyway, so one particular day, we're sitting in class, and it was about 10 minutes into the lecture. I'm doodling away, paying attention, and I noticed out of the corner of my eye that there was someone waving in the window, and they wanted to get in. So I looked around and I noticed that there was space in that first aisle, that first row, that was for students who were going to come in late. So I decided to be, a good Samaritan and get up and let this student in. Well, as soon as I stood up to be a good Samaritan, I was greeted with, "Sit down now. Dr. K will handle Dr. K's business." And he said this very loud. Needless to say, the entire class went silent, and I felt very small. And you know what I did? I sat down. Operant conditioning is all about the consequences of your actions. Like we said, it's all about the outcomes. So I told this story because it's going to make sense in just a little while, but you can imagine that you could ask yourself, what's the likelihood that I would get up and open the door in the future if this situation occurred again, right? What would you say? Probably not very likely, right? All right, so when we're talking about operant conditioning, as we know, was developed by B.F. Skinner, and basically B.F. Skinner remixed E.L. Thorndike's theory and his law of effect, and then Skinner, he built upon it and he came up with operant conditioning. So in our conversation today, we're going to mainly talk about reinforcement and punishment, but this is, the meat of what operant conditioning is all about. So it's all about the outcomes. Let's go ahead and take a quick quiz to see how much you know. Okay, so I'd like you to record the answers to this quiz in your notes. Okay. 1. If you were doing a crossword puzzle on the subject behavior modification and were asked for a synonym for a negative reinforcement, what word would you select? So a synonym for negative reinforcement. All right. 2. When you supply negative reinforcement, it usually results in, is it A, weakening a behavior that you want weakened, or B, strengthening a behavior you want strengthened? So when you supply negative reinforcement, it usually results in, is it A, weakening a behavior you want weakened, or B, strengthening a behavior you want strengthened? Okay, so these next 3 questions are simple yes or no responses. Do people usually look forward to receiving negative reinforcement? Yes or no? Do you anticipate regularly, consciously supplying positive reinforcement to those you might manage in the future? Yes or no? And do you anticipate regularly, consciously supplying negative reinforcement to those you might manage in the future? Yes or no? Okay, so we'll come back to the quiz and the story in a bit, but for now, I want to talk about some key concepts. And I want you to know that there's a fundamental difference between reinforcement and punishment. Okay, they have two different outcomes. Remember we said it's all about the outcomes. All right, so think of reinforcement as the gas pedal and punishment as the brakes. All right, if you're driving, what drives behavior? The gas pedal will be reinforcement and punishment would be the brakes. So over the next few slides, we're going to talk about the difference between reinforcement and punishment, the gas pedal and the brakes, primary and secondary reinforcement, positive and negative reinforcement, and if time allows, schedules of reinforcement. So with primary and secondary reinforcement, we're talking about the difference between things that are naturally rewarding, things that are naturally desirable, and things that have learned to be desirable. So an example of a primary reinforcer would be food or water. An example of a secondary reinforcer would be grades or money. All right, because grades and money basically can help you get food and water. And when we think about positive and negative, I want you to think of adding and subtracting. Don't think of good and bad, think of adding and subtracting. All right, so let's move on and look a little bit more closely at reinforcement and punishment. Keeping it simple. So I want you to remember that reinforcement leads to an increase in the probability that the person or the animal will engage in the behavior that brought them the reinforcement again. Okay, and punishment leads to a decrease in the probability that the organism will do the behavior again. Because remember we said there's a fundamental difference between reinforcement and punishment, and it's all about the outcomes. All right, so 3 simple questions that you want to consider when you're trying to determine if it's reinforcement or punishment. All right, are you adding something or taking it away? If you're adding something, it's positive. If you're taking away something, it's negative. Is the thing that you're adding desirable or undesirable? And last but not least, how likely is the organism to engage in the behavior in the future? So if you add something desirable, then how likely is the person to do it again in the future? Very likely, okay? If you, you have a sweet tooth and you are able to purchase some ice cream and the ice cream is delicious, the next time you get a sweet tooth, you might be more, you might be inclined to purchase some ice cream again. All right, so that's positive reinforcement. If you take away something desirable, so something you like, but it's being taken away, how likely are you to do it again? Not likely. Okay, so this is negative punishment. You're taking away something, so it's negative, and the person is not likely to do it again, so it's punishment. Now remember, when we're talking about reinforcement and punishment, we're dealing with probability, so we're not guaranteeing that the person is or is not going to do this behavior again. Other factors need to be considered. Now, example of punishment would be taking away a child's phone, for acting up in school. Okay, you're taking away something they like, and the idea is hopefully they won't do whatever it was to get them to get their privileges taken away in the future. Now, if you add something that is undesirable, so you're adding something, but it's something they don't like, this is positive punishment. Okay, so you see the positive and negative can become kind of awkward in terms of talking about punishment. I usually like to just talk about punishment in terms of punishment, but in some textbooks, the authors will separate positive and negative punishment. So positive punishment, you're adding something that they don't want. And then for negative reinforcement, this is taking away something that's undesirable. Okay, so just imagine you've been at the grocery store and you've seen maybe a father with his child or a mother with her child, and the child notices that there's candy and there's snacks and there's all types of cool stuff at the register, and the child wants the candy, the snacks. And so, you know, the parent gives in, and the parent gives in to get rid of the annoying nagging sound of give me the candy, I want the candy. Okay, this would be an example where the mother or the father, the parent, is being negatively reinforced because they're taking away something undesirable, the annoying sound of the kid whining, but the child is being positively reinforced. They're getting something, the candy, for what they did, which was whining. So the next time we're in that scenario, it's a vicious cycle of the child is thinking, well, there's a good chance I'll get what I want if I whine. And the parent is thinking if I give them what they want, they'll stop whining. So that would be negative reinforcement. An example of positive punishment would be if the parent looked over at the kid, gave them a dirty look, and maybe pinched them or popped them on the hand. And not that spanking is good or anything like that, but this would be an example of positive punishment. Okay, so now we're going to pull it all together. I want you to think back to the story I told you at the beginning of this talk with Dr. K. Which of the following terms is most applicable and why? Was this an example of negative reinforcement, positive reinforcement, negative punishment, or positive punishment? So I want you to write that answer in your notes along with your reasoning for why you think it is what it is. And now we're going to go over the answers to the quiz. Punishment is not a synonym for negative reinforcement. So I know some of you may have put punishment, but if you did, that is a very common mistake. And in the media, often people use the term punishment and negative reinforcement interchangeably, and it's not correct. But you know better now because punishment and reinforcement are fundamentally different. All right, the answer to number 2 is B. It strengthens the behavior, right? You're increasing the likelihood the person or the animal will engage in that behavior in the future. And then 3, 4, and 5 were all yes. You plan to use that again if reinforcement in the future if you are going to be a manager. You could even use reinforcement if you're a parent, or perhaps you might notice when you are being reinforced. All right, we're going to finish out with examples of schedules of reinforcement. And after I go over these, I want you to come up with your own examples, your own personal examples for the different schedules of reinforcement. All right, so to be clear, continuous reinforcement is reinforcement that the person or the animal gets every time. So every time the behavior happens, the desired behavior happens, it's reinforced. Okay, that's going to be continuous reinforcement. Partial reinforcement is when you get it sometimes, but not every time. When you first start off training a person or an animal, you want to use continuous reinforcement. It's most effective when training a new behavior. It creates a strong association between the behavior and the response. Now, partial reinforcement is once you've got the behavior, once the person or the animal has established behavior, then we're going to it's more effective for maintaining, the behavior. So the new behavior is less likely to disappear once you start applying a particular schedule of reinforcement. And each of the different schedules of reinforcement have a different rate of responding, which we'll get into in a future lesson. But there's 4 that we're going to focus on for the purpose of today. The first is fixed ratio. The second is going to be variable ratio, and then we'll look at fixed interval and then variable interval. So when you see fixed, think it's set. It's very specific. And when you see variable, think it varies. It's flexible. When you see ratio, think it's based on a number of responses. And when you see interval, think about an interval of time. Okay, so if you put it together, a fixed ratio is a set number of responses. All right. With variable ratio, there is a changing number of responses. And all this means that the reinforcement is contingent upon either with the fixed ratio, a set number of responses, or with variable ratio, unpredictable number of responses. All right. Now, fixed interval is we're going to say is a set amount of time, and then variable interval is going to be an unpredictable amount of time. All right. So you don't know when the reward is coming, but it's coming. So we're all out of time for today. What I would like to do is leave you with just a few additional resources. And I've just included two on the slide. One is a very comical, a 7-minute clip from Big Bang Theory where Sheldon is teaching Penny using shaping and positive reinforcement to get her to engage in a series of behaviors. And the other is Discovering Psychology Updated Edition, where it's a classic film about 60 minutes long, 35, 40 minutes going over operant conditioning in more detail.